Hello and welcome. In today's video, what I want to discuss is non-dualism, in particular non-dualism in Buddhism and early Buddhism. This is an enormous topic, the topic of non-dualism generally, so I'm only going to be able to give a pretty quick overview in this video, and even so it's going to be a lot of information here. It's kind of a geeky topic, but one that I know interests a lot of people because I do get a lot of questions in the comments of prior videos about discussing this very topic, so I thought it's time for it. It's something that I've actually been preparing for a couple of years, sort of getting ideas together. It's something that's interested me as well as looking at the history of this. So in today's video, what I'm going to do is we'll have 4 parts basically. To begin with, I'm going to have a quick look at what non-dualism is, what it means. Secondly, we'll turn to some of its origins in pre-Buddhist India. Again, we're looking at the Indian context here, so some of the origins before Buddhism. And then we'll look at early Buddhism in particular. And then we'll turn in the 4th part to some developments in later kinds of Buddhism. So first, what is non-dualism? Now, there are many ways to understand non-dualism, so again, I'm only going to be giving a quick overview of the possible ways that we can understand it here, and I'm sure if you are an expert on this topic, you can think of many, many others. But basically, non-dualism means that there aren't 2 of something. And now, one way that there might not be 2 of something is if there's only 1. And this is known as monism. So it could be, for example, a kind of non-dualism is to hold that all things are made out of one kind of stuff. That's a sort of philosophical kind of non-dualism. And we'll find in various philosophies, religions in India, ideas of monism through the ages. Also, non-dualism might mean that there are problems, for example, with our dualistic concepts. That is to say, that when we talk about good and bad, or right and wrong, or skillful and unskillful, or samsara and nirvana, or enlightened and unenlightened, and many, many other such dualities as these, that all of these are basically, in a sense, illusory. So that our concepts that involve comparisons like these are based upon some kind of fundamental mistake, that they get things wrong in some way, that there only really is one way things can be, or perhaps no way that things can be, depending on how one sees it. And so all of these dualistic kinds of concepts are in some way problematic. That's one form of non-dualism. Or non-dualism may be specific to a particular topic. So, for example, in much of Buddhism, it's understood that there isn't a permanent self. So we might say that there is a dualism of self and other, and this dualism of self and other is mistaken and illusory in some sense. And so we might just say that all we mean by non-dualism is just that this particular duality of self and other is problematic, but perhaps other dualities are not problematic. In other words, again, there are different ways of understanding non-dualism. Some of them are more limited, some of them are more global, some of them encompass certain features of reality or of the way we think about things, and other ways of understanding non-dualism are, again, encompass everything, all of our concepts in some way. I will say, however, that although this limited idea of non-dualism between self and other does indeed have a place in much of Buddhist thought, it tends to, as they say, ramify. It tends to expand over time into a more global sort of non-dualism about all things, and we're going to get into some of that in today's video. All of this said, by talking about non-dualism, it's not that there's something necessarily specifically wrong with the number 2. There's a problem wrong with triples and quadruples as well. So the idea is not that, the 2s are problematic, that the dualisms are problematic, but that there's sort of anything more than 1, or anything at all, perhaps. That there's any particular way we can understand things, or In other words, it's not just self and one other, it's self and any other, whether that's one or two or a dozen or a million. So these things get pretty complicated pretty fast here, and I think we're going to have to keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, second, I want to get to some of the ancient history of this concept, or where it may have originated within India. It's, of course, impossible to say for sure. A lot of it depends basically upon our interpretations of ancient texts. And of course, the texts that we have now almost certainly, or certainly don't reflect everything that was going on at the time in India. So we're somewhat limited in our information. But two places that we can find potential origins of this concept are in two of the earliest Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads are texts, the earliest ones of which were written perhaps 100 or 200 or 300 years before the Buddha's lifetime. It's believed that much of what the Buddha had to say was in opposition to some of the material in these Upanishads. The Upanishads were written in what's called the Vedic Brahmin tradition. That is, the Vedas, which were ancient texts written perhaps a millennium before the Buddha, or composed, I should say. They weren't written, they were oral texts, oral recitations. These stories that were in the Vedas were then interpreted and reinterpreted over the centuries. And eventually, what came to happen was that there were a number of philosophers, we might call them that, thinkers, who went off into the forest to speculate about grand topics. And these philosophers, these thinkers, composed these early Upanishads that were basically, it's too much to call them commentaries on the Vedas, but they were at least responses to the whole Vedic tradition. In any event, the earliest of these Upanishads that we're going to be looking at, the first of them was called the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which was composed sometime around 700 BCE, and the other, the Chandogya Upanishad, which was composed sometime between 700 and 600 BCE. And in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which we'll look at first, which is the earlier one, at least it's generally believed to be earlier, there are a couple of passages that are of interest when it comes to non-dualism. One of these discusses the word Advaita comes up in this Upanishad. Advaita is the Sanskrit word that can be translated non-dualism. And it says, an ocean, a seer alone without duality, that is Advaita, becomes he whose world is Brahma. Now this, to be fair, is one translation of this passage by Hume. There is another contemporary translation by Patrick Olivelle, where he translates it, he becomes the sole seer. That is to say, he's not a seer alone without duality, but he's the seer alone. He's the sole seer. And here we see one of the problems with translation here. Because in translating the text, we have to, in a sense, interpret what that text is supposed to be telling us. So as we see, one of the translators here thinks that the concept of non-duality comes up here, that this seer is seeing in a non-dualistic fashion. They're, in a sense, seeing their identity with Brahma, which is part of, in the Upanishadic tradition, how we gain awakening, how we gain liberation, is through an awareness, a seeing, an understanding that we ourselves are identical to the world, to the universe. However, we also see that there's a different translator who translates it somewhat differently and doesn't think that the concept of non-dualism really matters here. And that is something we're going to have to keep in mind, that a lot of these early texts really do depend on how we translate them, how we interpret them. Because these are such early texts, such early times at which these concepts appear, that it's not clear that they're there or not. Now there's another passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad which runs like this. When one has seen and heard oneself, when one has reflected and concentrated on oneself, one knows the whole world. And in a sense, this procedure of coming to know yourself and through the self coming to know the world is indeed exactly the same one that the Buddha used, at least in one interpretation, except that the Buddha came to see, when he looked into where his self should be, what he found was non-self, that anywhere he looked, he couldn't find a self. So in that way, the Buddha, in a sense, took this direction that the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad was going in, this practice of the early Upanishads, and turned it in a different direction. Now we can turn to a slightly later Upanishad, again appears to be before the Buddha's lifetime, called the Chandogya Upanishad. And in this one, a man named Uddalaka Aruni talks to his son, Shvetaketu, and tells his son to cut up a banyan fruit. And when the son cuts up the banyan fruit, there are seeds inside of it. And then Uddalaka tells his son to take one of the seeds and cut it up into parts. And then he says, "What do you see there?" "Nothing, sir." Then he told him, "This finest essence here, son, that you can't even see. Look how on account of that finest essence, this huge banyan tree stands here. Believe, my son, the finest essence here, that constitutes the self of this whole world. That is the truth. That is the self. And that's how you are, Shvetaketu." And the word "that's how you are" translates the Sanskrit tat tvam asi, which is a very important phrase in early Brahminic philosophy. Tat tvam asi, that's how you are. So what Uddalaka is telling his son Shvetaketu is that basically your essence, your soul, your self, your Atman is the same as that of the whole world. That your soul is the world's soul, if you like. That you are identical with Brahman. Now, there are various ways, many ways of interpreting this very deep kind of claim. But one classic way of interpreting it is what we might say non-dualistically, where that is to say that we would ordinarily think of the distinction between the self and the world as a dualism, as two different things. But in fact, what Uddalaka is saying is that they aren't two different things, they're the same thing. So we interpret it, as I say, non-dualistically. And it's through that deep understanding, it's believed, that we attain liberation. Now, having gone through some of these pre-Buddhist ideas of non-dualism, let's turn instead and turn really to the meat of the point here, which is about early Buddhism. What was the view of early Buddhism to non-dualism? And what I want to do in this section here is to begin with the ways that early Buddhism can be seen as opposed to the idea of non-dualism, as not non-dualistic, if you like. And then later on, I'm going to turn to certain ways in which non-dualism can be found in aspects of early Buddhism. So let's turn to early Buddhism. And if we look at these early texts, one of the things that we find there is that the Buddha argues strenuously against any attempt on our part to identify ourselves with the world. Indeed, in a very famous early text, which I've discussed many times in this channel, called the Sutta on the snake, the water snake, the Buddha specifically says that one of the standpoints of wrong views lies in identifying the self with the world. That kind of identification is, in other words, a kind of illusion. Elsewhere, in the first text in the Majjhima Nikaya, which is a very important and deep kind of philosophical text, the Buddha also argues against our tendency to identify ourselves with the all, with unity, or with diversity for that matter. In other words, any kind of attempt to identify the self with anything is a problem, because for the Buddha, to do that would be to assume that there was such a thing as the self that we had found by inspection. And the Buddha thinks we cannot find such a self by inspection. If we look into our experiences, all we find are things that are always changing. We don't find anything permanent. And so, therefore, there is nothing to identify with, either with unity, with diversity, with the world, with the all. All of these things are sort of like wrong turns that we can take. So, to put it another way, the Buddha didn't believe that we could identify anything with the self. So therefore, it was doubly wrong to think we could identify everything with the self. Also, when talking about non-dualism, as we mentioned before, it doesn't just mean that twos are a problem, but that sort of anything more than one, or maybe even anything at all, is a problem. The Buddha's general teaching style and learning style was analytic, in other words, in terms of analyzing things into their parts. And to that extent, any kind of a non-dualistic approach would be opposed to the way he ordinarily reacted to things. He analyzed things into kinds, into degrees. He distinguished right from wrong, skillful from unskillful, good from bad. These are the kinds of distinctions that really ground the Dharma, the teaching of the early, or I should say the early Buddhist teachings. One very famous early text is the sutta on the two kinds of thought, where the Buddha talks about how important it was in the time that he was, before he was awakened or enlightened, that he as a young person distinguished thoughts into two types, skillful thoughts and unskillful thoughts. And having made that important distinction, then got to work trying to foster the skillful ones and trying to denourish the unskillful ones. That's kind of the path that he saw for himself as he worked towards enlightenment over many, many years. So once he became enlightened, much of the heart of the teaching of the Buddha is in terms of numbers of things, right? The three marks of existence, the Four Noble Truths, the five aggregates, the Eightfold Path, and so many other things are divulged or taught in terms of numbers, where what he's trying to do is analyze things into parts or degrees or stages along a path so that we can understand them in a fuller way by understanding each of their parts individually. And then to look at some of the texts that remain to us, the first chapter of the Dhammapada. If we look at the first chapter, it's often translated as dualisms. This one that I have by Gil Fronsdale translates it dichotomies, but basically that means the same thing. And this text here, the numerical discourses of the Buddha, the Anguttara Nikaya in Pali, is one of the Nikayas, one of the basic groups of early Buddhist texts. And this group of texts is organized in terms of numbers. So we have all the ones, all the twos, all the threes, and so on and so on and so on. Again, all of these suggest that the Buddha did not think in non-dualistic terms, but rather in terms of analysis of things into parts and degrees and kinds as a way to help us conceptually understand them, and so put that understanding into practice. Now, all of this kind of awareness that I've gone through here about how early Buddhism is not non-dualistic is sort of in the background when Bhikkhu Bodhi, a very famous translator, indeed translated the Anguttara Nikaya, many other things, a scholar and monk, he wrote many years ago, or several years ago, an essay, a very famous essay called Dhamma and Non-Duality, where he took on this very question of whether early Buddhism, the Buddhism that we find in the teachings of, at least as far as we know, the historical Buddha. And Bhikkhu Bodhi says this. He says, "The teachings of the Buddha as found in the Pali Canon does not endorse a philosophy of non-dualism of any variety, nor would I add, can a non-dualistic perspective be found lying implicit within the Buddha's discourses. The Buddha's approach does not aim at the discovery of a unifying principle behind or beneath our experience of the world." In other words, a principle of non-dualism could be thought of as a kind of, again, a unifying principle, a sort of a single principle that unifies all of the teachings. And we will indeed find that in some later interpretations of Buddhism, or obviously other non-Buddhist kinds of philosophies. But as Bhikkhu Bodhi says, we don't find that kind of principle in early Buddhism. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi's point is that we don't find any non-dualism in early Buddhism at all, and I think there are a couple of possible responses here. I think in the main, Bhikkhu Bodhi is certainly right. However, there are ways of understanding aspects of early Buddhist teachings in which non-dualism does play a role. In particular, when it comes to this idea of a unifying principle in early Buddhism, again, really we don't find much of one, but if we wanted to try to look for one, we might. For example, there is the very famous statement in early Buddhism that all dharmas are non-self, sabbe dhamma anatta. And that can be interpreted pretty clearly as potentially non-dualistic, in the sense that all dharmas is another word for, there's many ways of interpreting the word dharma, and that's part of the problem, but it can be interpreted as simply events that happen in the world, or dharmas. It can also be interpreted as our experiences are dharmas, that all of our experiences are non-self. But either way we interpret it, this seems to unify all of the dharmas, all of the experiences, perhaps even all of the events of the world, as being of one particular type, non-self. And if we look at it that way, and many people did over the centuries and millennia after the Buddha's lifetime, we might begin to see the germ, the kernel of a non-dualistic philosophy right there, and indeed we'll get more to that coming up. It's also the case that many people have found a kind of non-dualistic practice within concentration meditation. In particular, the achievement of particular kinds of jhana. And jhana meditation is a kind of absorptive meditation. It takes many, many, many hours of practice over long periods of time. But eventually the mind becomes absorbed in a particular kind of experience. And that experience can be thought of as, or can be approached as, or can seem to be non-dualistic. In particular, in one of the early texts, the nun Dhammadina, when asked about meditation, when asked about particularly concentration meditation, she says that concentration meditation, which is exemplified in particular by jhana, aims at the unification of the mind. Now, there are many ways to understand, again, unification of the mind, what that potentially means. That sort of one-pointed mind that occurs in this kind of a deep meditation. But one way to interpret that is to interpret it, again, non-dualistically. So the mind becomes unified, which is to say, not dualist, right? So it becomes unified in the sense that it understands everything in terms of one, of everything being the same kind. And usually this kind of experience of non-dualistic or non-dualistic mindfulness, as Anālayo calls it, Anālayo being another wonderful translator and interpreter of the early texts, scholar and also meditator. Anālayo talks about how the fourth jhana, which is the deepest of the four jhanas, is often thought of as sort of a non-dual mindfulness kind of experience, where the boundaries between self and other break down. I was also in a talk a while ago at New York Insight with Bodhipaksha, who is another wonderful teacher and meditator, who talked in a very similar kind of way about his experience of the fourth jhana being a kind of non-dualistic experience of the world, where, again, the boundaries between self and other break down and one stops seeing the world in terms of that kind of dualism. Now, it's also the case that some quite obscure early texts, there are a few texts in the early tradition that are quite obscure and difficult to interpret. Some of these are taken non-dualistically. In particular, there's an essay by John Amaro where he discusses, I believe it's called The Buddha on Non-Duality. I have a link to all these texts down in the notes, by the way. And he takes three texts that he looks at. Two of them are obscure texts in the early tradition out of the Udana, which is a collection, again, of early texts. And then he also looks at another text from the later tradition, which I'm not going to focus on here. But in any event, in the two early texts, what I think typifies both of the texts that he looks at, and I don't have time to go into both of them today because it would be too long a video, but neither of them actually talk explicitly of non-dualism. So what Ajahn Amaro here is interpreting them as expressing a non-dualistic philosophy, even though the texts don't actually say that. One of them is a very famous text to Bahia of the bark cloth, who was a renunciant of a different tradition who comes to the Buddha and wants a very quick, sort of encapsulated Dharma talk. And the Buddha gives him a talk basically telling him, when you experience something, stay only with the experience. Don't proliferate around that experience, basically. Don't obsess about it. Don't sort of let that experience take your mind off in this direction and that, but just stay with the experience itself. That's basically what the Buddha tells him. Now, this could potentially be interpreted non-dualistically, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It could be interpreted simply as the Buddha, again, telling Bahia that the problem that you have to overcome in attaining awakening is this problem of overcoming mental proliferation. So, and the same thing is true of, again, of the other texts where these can be interpreted in different ways. Basically, the term non-dual, which in Pali would be advayam, that term is very rarely used in the early texts. So if we want to look for, if we're interested in whether or not non-dualism is held in early Buddhism, what we would do is look for it. Is it mentioned there? Very, very few times is that term used, so far as I can tell. If you know of some particular place that I haven't mentioned here, please let me know in the notes. But basically, for the most part, there's one particular form of the discussion of non-dualism that occurs many times, sort of repeated. This is something that happens in the early texts, that you have a kind of a template of a discussion that is made in one place and then repeated word for word in many other places, or almost word for word. And one of these discusses 10 different kinds of meditation, which, among other things, are called non-dualistic meditations. And the Buddha discusses each of these, and then particularly highlights one as being paramount. And the Buddha says about that paramount form of this non-dualistic meditation, the best of these 10 universal dimensions of meditation is when someone perceives the meditation on universal consciousness, above, below, across, non-dual and limitless. And here we have perhaps the closest thing to an example of non-dualism in the early texts, where, again, the Buddha is describing and indeed promoting a kind of non-dual consciousness, a meditation that involves a consciousness presumably that does not see distinctions in things, or perhaps does not see distinctions between self and other. However, after having made this point, the Buddha then goes on to elaborate further and says that this form of non-dual meditation should not be identified with enlightenment. It's not enlightenment. It's a form also of conditioning. It's a conditioned thought. It's a conditioned form of meditation. And as such, while it is a good form of practice, there's nothing wrong with it, we will have to eventually become disillusioned with it in order to attain enlightenment. So again, while non-dualism does exist in the early texts, it's not to be confused with enlightenment itself. Also, non-dualism occurs in one place in the text that describes the end of the Buddha's life, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where Ananda, who is the Buddha's close attendant, is said to practice a form of loving kindness that's so pure that it's a form of non-dualism, that it's non-dual, sort of a non-dual practice. And here, that's not elaborated upon again in that sutta, but I think we might understand it to mean that he has a form of kindness and compassion that's so pure in general that it doesn't recognize distinctions between himself, and other people. In other words, that he holds other people with as much kindness as he holds himself, and as much compassion and so on. But again, otherwise, so far as I can tell, this term for non-dualism doesn't appear in the early suttas, and as Bhikkhu Bodhi expressed earlier on, there doesn't seem to be a way to easily interpret the Buddha's Dharma, the early Buddhist Dharma, in non-dualistic terms, in any kind of global sense. So, having said that, now let's turn to some later interpretations and later developments in Buddhism. And later Buddhism gets very complicated very fast, so I'm only again going to be talking about this on a very basic level. But in general, much of the problem in later Buddhism comes up with this interpretation of shunyata, of emptiness, of the emptiness of all things. And now emptiness is a way of expressing non-self. That is to say that the self is, or I should say that this being is empty of a self, let's say. That breaks down, as we've already seen and discussed, any kind of distinction between self and other that is fundamental, shall we say. But it goes further than that. The ramifications go further, and this idea of breaking down this distinction between self and other is kind of like a wedge that opens up a larger kind of doorway to a different way of seeing the entire Dharma. Because if we think of everything that we see, all of our experiences, all of our concepts, as essentially like little selves, then each of them is individually open to just this same kind of move, right? So just as this being here does not contain a permanent, essential, unchanging self, so we might say that each of our experiences, each of our ideas, our thoughts, our concepts, all of them are the same way, that there isn't anything essential, permanent, unchanging in them either. And so each of them is empty of a self. Each of them is empty of any kind of inherent, permanent nature. And if we begin to see things that way, then all kinds of ordinary distinctions seem to break down. These ideas began in the early centuries of the Common Era in what are called the Prajnaparamita Sutras, or the very end of the period before the Common Era, and they were eventually put together in a very elegant way by the philosopher Nagarjuna, and then interpreted and reinterpreted in arguments back and forth from different schools over the centuries. At this point, once we get to Nagarjuna, and even just before Nagarjuna even, we really are in a period of what we might call sort of professional Buddhist thinkers. People in large established monasteries who really could spend all of their lives in contemplation, in reasoning, in thinking, in arguing, in debating, in trying to find deeper truths underneath the surface descriptions of the Dharma and of all of the Buddha's teachings. And so as a result, things get, again, very complicated very fast, very deep, very recondite. The arguments become more and more difficult to follow because you really have to know every step along the way. But one important distinction that comes up is kind of a distinction between what we might term ontological non-dualism and experiential or epistemological non-dualism. Ontological non-dualism has to do with the features of reality, that reality itself is non-dualistic. Whereas experiential or epistemological, that is how we know about things, that kind of non-dualism doesn't talk about the external world or the way things really are, but just talks about the way things seem to us, that our experiences are in some sense non-dualistic. And this kind of distinction is then discussed, argued over, refined in various schools of the Mahayana Buddhism, as well as in schools of what is called Advaita Vedanta, which is the form in which these kinds of ideas enter Hinduism. Advaita Vedanta may go back into the into the past quite a bit before this. It's not entirely clear. There's all kinds of arguments about how that began, and that's not really the topic of this video anyway. But there are many similarities between the philosophies of Advaita Vedanta and some of these early Mahayana philosophies. There probably was a lot of cross-cultural interchange there. But in Mahayana Buddhism, this non-dualism is perhaps best typified by the non-dualistic consciousness we find in what is called Yogacara Buddhism. Yogacara was a reaction against some of the ideas of Nagarjuna and of the Madhyamaka, which is the school that Nagarjuna founded. Their belief was that the emptiness that was expressed in the Madhyamaka was sort of too empty, that it was too close to nihilism, and that what was much more accurate in expressing the Dharma was this understanding that it wasn't that there was literally nothing, or at least that's how they interpreted the emptiness of Nagarjuna, but rather that there was this consciousness, in a sense, that underlay everything. A non-dual consciousness, a consciousness without distinctions. Now, as I say, there are a couple of different ways that this can be interpreted, this Yogacara philosophy. It could be interpreted ontologically as saying that there is this real, objective, non-conditioned field of reality out there, out of which conditioning arises. That is to say, this real, ontologically real, external field of non-dualism, out of which all of our dualisms, all of our comparisons and analyses arise in some sense. That's one way to interpret it. Another way to interpret it, as I've said, is more experiential or epistemological. So if we interpret it this way, the Yogacharans aren't making any claims about the external world as such. What they're saying is that our appearances are non-dualistic in some sense. That is to say, we look everything around us, we seem to see distinctions between things. Certain things are white and other things are black. Certain things are bad and other things are good. But when we really get into deep meditation or deep philosophical analysis, these distinctions seem to break down. And so we can no longer hold them, and we begin to see that these distinctions are in some sense illusory. So if we understand the Yogacara in that sense, again, they're not making any claim about the external world. What they're making is a claim about how experience seems to us, how appearances appear to us, if you like. Now, I should say that Yogacara recently has been interpreted in both ways by different scholars. That is to say, Paul Williams has said in one of his books that he believes that the Yogacara in its essence is a form of ontological non-dualism, whereas Dan Lusthaus, another contemporary scholar, has argued the reverse, that in fact if you look at it deeply, Yogacara is not ontological, but just making expressions about our appearances. I'm not going to try to answer that question. My guess would be, and this is only a guess, is that it's probably both, in the sense that you would probably have different texts, different thinkers over the millennia who would have taken both sides of that issue. Just because it's, both sides are available to philosophers or thinkers who want to express their thoughts, and so probably there are ones who express both, but that's a question for deeper scholarship. And what I should say also is that this feeds into a different kind of a different kind of idea that comes up in these forms of later Buddhism. That is to say, the idea of two truths. So the idea of two truths is this idea that there is a conventional truth, the truth of every day, if you like, and there is an ultimate truth, the way things really are, or the way things are at a deeper level of understanding. In conventional truth, therefore, there are these dualities, right? So there are the dualities of self and other. There are the dualities that we see in the world around us, or seem to see. Whereas, if we get deeper, we find that these conventional dualities disappear. And that, indeed, is found in both Madhyamaka and Yogacara Buddhism. Madhyamaka seeing that they dissolve into shunyata, into emptiness, and the Yogacara seeing that they dissolve into, well, it also can be called emptiness, but their interpretation of that is a kind of a non-dual consciousness that seems to lie behind our experiences of things in the world. And indeed that this very distinction between conventional and ultimate is itself a duality, which also must be seen to be conventional in a sense. And I did an earlier video on this question about these two truths, in fact 2 videos, and I'll put a link to the first one where I get into the early history of it up here on the screen, and if you like that you can see the second one too on the later developments. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, take a look over at my Patreon page and see if you want to join us and help support the channel. Thanks so much to all of you, and we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.